Hey guys, join me as I dive deep into this crazy story to find out if a husband really took deadly revenge on his cheating wife after a TV show exposed her. Before I start, did you know that over 20% of married individuals admit to infidelity? But what if the betrayal wasn't just private? What if it was exposed for the world to see? What would you do if your spouse's affair was broadcasted on national television? Kyle thought he had the perfect marriage until one night he saw something that shattered his world. His wife, Rebecca, wasn't just unfaithful, she was publicly flaunting her affair on a reality TV show. This is the shocking story of a man pushed to the edge by betrayal. Rebecca and Kyle Anderson's seemingly perfect suburban life shattered in an instant when an affair exposed on national television pushed their marriage to its breaking point. What began as a quiet betrayal spiraled into a devastating tragedy, leaving a once loving husband to make a choice that would change everything forever. Rebecca and Kyle Anderson's life appeared to be the epitome of suburban bliss. They lived in a charming two-story home on a tree-lined street in a quiet neighborhood. From the outside, they had everything anyone could ask for: a successful career, two children who excelled in school, and a seemingly happy marriage. Their circle of friends often praised them as the ideal couple, always talking about their shared love for family vacations, community events, and their devotion to one another. Kyle worked long hours at a tech company, but he did it to provide for his family. His job was demanding, but Rebecca, a stay-at-home mom, had always been supportive. She spent her days taking care of the kids, driving them to school and extracurricular activities, and maintaining their home. She prided herself on making sure their lives ran smoothly, keeping everything in order, and supporting her husband when he needed a break from his hectic work schedule. They had a comfortable rhythm, and the kids, Lily, age 6, and Ethan, age 9, thrived in this environment. But as the months passed, Kyle began to notice subtle changes in Rebecca's behavior. At first, it was nothing he could put his finger on, just small shifts in the way she interacted with him. Their conversations seemed less engaged, more surface level. She no longer asked him about his day, nor did she talk about hers with the same enthusiasm. At first, he dismissed it. It could have been stress, or perhaps she was just feeling a little overwhelmed with her routine. But as time went on, Kyle's suspicions grew. Rebecca became more distant in the evenings, spending hours on her phone, texting, and scrolling through social media in a way she never had before. When Kyle would ask her who she was talking to, she would casually shrug it off or offer vague responses. Her mood seemed to fluctuate, from cheerful to agitated, and the warmth that had once characterized their relationship felt absent. She was still there physically, but mentally it seemed as though she had withdrawn into herself. One night, after a particularly long day at work, Kyle came home to find Rebecca in the living room, staring intently at her phone. She didn't notice him come in, and the screen of her phone turned bright as she tapped away, absorbed in whatever conversation was taking place. Kyle felt an uncomfortable knot form in his stomach. He had never been the type to invade her privacy, but something inside him told him that something was off. His gut instincts only grew sharper when Rebecca began spending more time away from home, claiming that she needed some personal time to recharge. She started attending evening yoga classes more frequently, sometimes returning home late into the night, smelling of lavender and sweat. Kyle didn't think much of it at first. After all, Rebecca had always been health conscious and enjoyed her fitness routine. But as the weeks went by, he started noticing how her excuses began to pile up. She no longer had time for family dinners or even simple chats over coffee in the mornings. It was as if she was slipping away bit by bit. Kyle tried to confront her about the growing distance between them, but every time he did, Rebecca would brush it off, telling him that he was overthinking things. But Kyle knew better. He could feel the divide, and it was only growing wider with each passing day. What hurt the most was that Rebecca no longer seemed interested in fixing it, as though she had already mentally checked out of the marriage. Still, Kyle couldn't bring himself to fully acknowledge the possibility that something was wrong. He loved Rebecca and didn't want to believe that she could be hiding something. But deep down, the nagging feeling that something was amiss lingered like a dark cloud hovering over their otherwise perfect life. It was a feeling that would soon be impossible to ignore. One evening, Kyle sat down after a long day of work to unwind in front of the TV. He flipped through the channels absent-mindedly, trying to distract himself from the ongoing tension at home. He wasn't even particularly interested in watching anything specific, but when he stumbled across a reality TV show called Truth or Lies, something about it caught his attention. The show featured people confessing secrets on national television, revealing everything from cheating to hidden addictions. The host, a charismatic celebrity known for his no-nonsense approach, guided guests through tough, revealing questions. Kyle had heard about it in passing, but never really paid it much mind. That night, however, something felt different. He lingered on the channel for a few moments, curious about the episode that was airing. The camera zoomed in on a woman sitting across from the host, her face looking both nervous and defiant as the show's dramatic music played in the background. The host began asking her questions about her marriage. The woman's eyes darted nervously, and she seemed reluctant to answer at first. The tension in the room was palpable. Kyle leaned forward on the couch, his attention suddenly sharpened. As the host probed deeper, he heard the name Rebecca Anderson. His heart skipped a beat. His mind raced as he questioned whether he had misheard. But the camera zoomed in on the woman's face, and the truth hit him with the force of a freight train. It was Rebecca. Before he could even process the shock, the host asked a question that would change everything. "Have you been unfaithful to your husband?" Rebecca hesitated for a moment. Then her voice cracked as she admitted to the affair. Kyle's stomach turned. She spoke about how she had met another man a year ago, someone from her yoga class, and how the relationship had evolved from innocent flirtation to a full-blown affair. She admitted to lying to Kyle, hiding her messages, sneaking around behind his back. She even detailed how the affair had become a significant part of her life, a secret she was no longer able to keep hidden. As Kyle watched, the weight of her words sank in. He was frozen, unable to look away from the screen, even as his world felt like it was unraveling before his eyes. Rebecca's voice trembled as she confessed the hurt she had caused, but it didn't sound like remorse. It sounded like an explanation, a justification. She spoke of feeling neglected in their marriage, of missing the emotional connection she once had with Kyle. The affair, she said, had been her way of finding that missing piece. The more Kyle heard, the more he couldn't believe it. The woman he had loved for years, the mother of his children, was confessing her betrayal on live television. Kyle's mind was overwhelmed with questions. How could she do this? Why didn't she tell him? Why did she let it go on for so long? He couldn't grasp the fact that he was hearing this on a TV show of all places, a reality show that millions of people were watching. Just as his wife spoke about the affair, with no regard for the damage it would cause. But the show didn't end there. The host pushed her further, asking about the affair's impact on their marriage and the children. Rebecca was candid about the emotional toll the affair had taken on her, but the way she spoke about it made Kyle sick. She didn't seem ashamed. She didn't seem sorry. It was as if the affair had been a solution to her unhappiness rather than the devastating betrayal it truly was. By the time the segment finished, Kyle was no longer sitting on the couch. He was pacing, his mind racing, his chest tight with a mixture of disbelief and anger. The woman on the screen wasn't the wife he had known. This was someone else, someone he didn't recognize. And that realization made him feel more alone than he ever had before. She didn't even try to hide it anymore. The subtle looks on her face when she picked up the phone, the late-night absences, the small gestures. It all pointed to the fact that she wasn't even remotely interested in repairing their marriage. For Kyle, this was the ultimate betrayal. The affair was bad enough, but the fact that Rebecca wasn't even trying to fix things, that she was still emotionally involved with another man, was more than he could bear. He felt like an outsider in his own home, a mere bystander in the life he had built with Rebecca. And despite the occasional apology, despite her claims of wanting to make things right, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was simply playing a part, one that no longer included him. In his darker moments, Kyle found himself replaying the words she had spoken on the show, how she had felt neglected, how the affair had been her way of finding solace. He wondered if he had missed something, if he could have done something differently. But deep down, he knew this wasn't his fault. Rebecca had made a choice, and that choice had led them down a path neither of them could come back from. Yet despite the clarity of the situation, Kyle couldn't escape the emotional turmoil. The anger built inside him, festering like a wound that refused to heal. Each day it seemed to grow deeper, harder to control. As the days turned into weeks, Kyle found himself spiraling further into a state of emotional chaos. The once steady, routine life he had built with Rebecca felt like a distant memory, a past life he couldn't return to. And as the distance between them grew, so did the darkness in his heart. The days following Rebecca's continued betrayal seemed to stretch on endlessly for Kyle. The more he observed her indifference toward their marriage, the more desperate he became to regain some semblance of control over his life. It wasn't just that his wife had betrayed him. It was that she had done so in such a public and unapologetic way. The affair, which had once been a secret, had now been broadcast to the world. It was no longer just a personal wound. It had been weaponized, used as fodder for entertainment on a reality TV show. Kyle's pride had been shattered. It was almost as if his identity had been taken from him. But it wasn't only the humiliation that gnawed at him. It was the raw, suffocating anger. The type of anger that festered when you felt utterly powerless and betrayed. Kyle had never been a violent man. He wasn't the type to lash out or resort to extreme measures to solve problems. But the more he thought about it, the more the idea of confronting Rebecca consumed him. It wasn't just a confrontation he wanted. It was a resolution, an end to this nightmare that had been consuming his every thought. That evening, as Kyle sat in their quiet living room, something in him snapped. He stared at the phone in his hand, its screen illuminated by a message Rebecca had just sent. She was talking about plans to meet up with her lover again. He read the message over and over, each time his heart sinking a little more. He had tried to remain calm. He had tried to reason with himself, convincing himself that his anger was irrational, that things could still be salvaged. But the realization that Rebecca had no intention of stopping the affair crushed any lingering hope. He stood up suddenly, the tension in his muscles building. It was as if a switch had flipped in his mind. The hours of sleepless nights, the weight of constant betrayal, the fear of being utterly alone. It all came to a head. For the first time in weeks, Kyle didn't feel powerless. In fact, he felt a sickening sense of clarity, as if he had finally found a way to take control of his shattered world. It was as though the gun he had bought several days earlier had materialized from the depths of his rage, a tool that could end the chaos once and for all. The decision to buy the weapon had come out of nowhere, a rash impulse that he hadn't shared with anyone. He had never owned a gun before, nor had he ever considered owning one. But after hours of pacing, after feeling like he had no other recourse, he had walked into a store and made the purchase. At the time, it had felt like an abstract solution, something that offered a way to protect himself from the storm raging inside him. But now, as he stood in the living room, the gun felt tangible in his hands, its cold weight grounding him in the harsh reality of what he was considering. He heard the sound of the door opening as Rebecca returned home, her footsteps echoing through the hallway. She seemed oblivious to the tension in the air. It was almost as if everything was normal to her. She was carrying on with her day, unaware of the growing storm brewing within Kyle. The bitterness he had been harboring for weeks came to a boiling point. The thought that she would still be seeing the other man, still betraying him in every possible way, pushed Kyle's sanity to its limits. He couldn't take it anymore. He felt cornered, overwhelmed by a desire to make the pain stop, to finally have a resolution, one that didn't involve the endless heartache of rejection and betrayal. As Rebecca entered the living room, Kyle was already standing near the door, his hand tight around the grip of the gun. His thoughts were a blur of rage, humiliation, and desperation. He didn't want to hurt her, or so he convinced himself. But deep down, Kyle knew that something inside him had already broken, and there was no turning back now. Rebecca looked at him in confusion, perhaps sensing the tension in the air, but unaware of the danger she was walking into. She didn't even flinch as Kyle took a step closer, his mind clouded with a mixture of fury and hopelessness. The man who had once been her partner was no longer the same. The next few moments unfolded in a blur of shocking clarity, and as Kyle raised the gun, he felt the crushing weight of the decision he was about to make. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the house like a scream, piercing the thick, oppressive silence that had settled between them. For a moment, everything stopped. Rebecca collapsed to the floor, her body crumpling in a way that felt surreal, like it was happening in slow motion. The room seemed to shrink around Kyle, and the weight of his actions hit him like a tidal wave. There was no sense of triumph, no satisfaction from finally taking control of a shattered life. Instead, there was only the suffocating presence of regret and fear. Neighbors who had heard the gunshot called 911, and within minutes, the sound of sirens could be heard in the distance, growing louder. Kyle now fully understood what he had done. By the time the police arrived, it was too late. Rebecca was dead, and Kyle was arrested on the spot, his hands still trembling from the weight of his decision. The media frenzy that followed was relentless. The story of a broken man, driven to violence by betrayal and humiliation, spread across the news. Kyle, once a man who seemed so ordinary, became a cautionary tale. In the courtroom, the prosecution painted Kyle as a man who had lost control in the heat of passion, while his defense attorneys argued that he'd been pushed to the brink by his wife's infidelity and the very public humiliation that followed. The trial went on for months with no clear resolution, But the damage had already been done. Kyle had lost everything: his wife, his children, his freedom. What do you think? Was Kyle a victim of his emotions, or was his reaction justified? Let us know in the comments, and if you love intense real-life stories like this, make sure to subscribe and check out our other videos.